Alright guys, welcome back to the channel, it's Maddie here, and welcome back to what would be Meta Monday. However, it is Tuesday. I've been sick over the last few days, so I have not been able to record anything, and I do apologize for that, but we're back. And yes, what we normally do on Mondays is we do our weekly meta report, where we analyze the Pokemon TCG Pocket metagame, and we take a look at everything going on in the competitive world of Pokemon TCG Pocket. Like I said, it's Tuesday, but we're going to go ahead and do that today. We are back on the channel. I'm better now, so we're going to be able to, have some more videos here on the channel and get back to things as they were previously. This week's actually a little bit different. So while I was unable to make content, I was keeping up to date with what was going on this past weekend in terms of competitions, and there's actually a lot to talk about. A lot of really cool stuff has happened. This weekend, we actually had two really large tournaments. So normally we take a look at the Ursiiday's Pocket Weekly. It's the largest weekly tournament series for Pokemon TCG Pocket. However, this weekend we also had the Hooglandia-Spragels Open Tournament, which had almost 1,000 players competing in it, as well as Ursiiday's having just over 1,000 players. So almost, I think, 2,000 players were competing in a Pokemon TCG Pocket tournament this weekend, which is really, really cool. So we're going to cover both of these tournaments because the results are actually quite different, and the metagame and the data and everything is actually a little bit different. So, and I think that does make sense. I think that the Ursiiday's tournament really does have its sort of own meta, as we kind of cover it every week. I think a lot of the people that maybe watch our videos also play in the tournament. So it seems to have its sort of its own metagame going on, whereas the Spragels Hooglandia tournament, of course, is going to have its own metagame, which is probably somewhat defined by, those two content creators and the content that they make, which is just kind of interesting to see. But first of all, let's take a look here at the Ursiiday's tournament, and these were the standings. So this week we did see Dialga and Arceus winning, and I kind of assumed we would be getting something like this. Last week, it was by far the most dominant deck, but it did not win. Rampardos-Lucario won last week, basically the #1 heavy counter to Dialga and Arceus. This week, there probably was a little bit more normalization of the decks that people were playing. We'll go ahead and we'll take a look at the meta share in a little bit for this tournament, but as we see, the #1 and #2 placing decks here, first and second place, we're both playing Dialga and Arceus. Third place was Rampardos-Lucario, so at some point or another, the Rampardos player seemingly had lost to one of these Dialga and Arceus players, but we can kind of infer that, it was somewhat likely that it was going to place very high in this tournament, as well as a couple down here at 8th and 9th place. However, if we go past that, if we go past top 8, we see that the tournament was almost entirely, top cut rather, was entirely dominated by Dialga and Arceus. And I think that this kind of makes a lot of sense. If we go down a little bit farther, we see there was actually quite a bit of variance in the other decks. I'm going to zoom out a little bit. Some of the other decks and archetypes that we saw make it into top cut, about probably 64 people, I would think, made it into top cut. So a lot of different variants. Realistically, there was some grass decks, some fighting decks, a lot of water decks as well. Water seemingly, or definitely, I should say, the #3, kind of archetype right now, depending on which water deck you're playing. Articuno, Palkia. There was sort of this new version of Palkia that cropped up just this weekend and actually did do pretty well, and it is going to be this Palkia EX with the Origin Form Palkia card, which is interesting. We'll take a look at that in a little bit, but yeah, so this was the final standings. Arceus-Dialga did win this week. I think that it made sense that it was going to win sooner or later, whether the format was just heavily counter meta, or displaying a counter meta, and heavily favoring sort of the decks that were strong against Arceus and Dialga. By far, the #1 most played deck has remained to be these Dialga Arceus decks. They're just really, really strong. In our last video that we made 4 days ago now, we kind of talked about how there wasn't really much in the format that was strong against Metal Arceus. These Dialga and Arceus decks, they really didn't have a strong counter other than Rampardos-Lucario, which really does kind of open up the way for a lot of those fighting decks to come in, but nothing really else to cement itself as a top deck in the format other than these water type decks, which did see some representation. But realistically, if we're taking a look at like top 16, there's very few in comparison to something like Arceus and Dialga. But let's go ahead and let's quickly take a look here. And this is something that's pretty interesting to me. I did cover this list originally when this mini set did come out, when Tri-Fit Light was released. I did realize that this would probably be the new strongest deck here, but what we didn't know, or I guess what we don't know yet, is still maybe what the best way to play this deck is. Now, we are seeing some Mew EX here in the #1 placing deck of the tournament, the winning deck. And in my video where I was, making, a showcase of this particular archetype, I did run Mew EX. I thought that the Palkia decks and water decks in general would be exceptionally strong with the inclusion of Irida and the other water type support cards that we've gotten. So I thought Mew EX was a really good card. It does help counter things like Palkia EX. You can, revenge attack it with genome hacking, copy that attack, do 150. Can be really strong against Palkia, but strong in other matchups as well. So I thought that Mew EX would be a good inclusion in the Arceus-Dialga archetype, similar to what we saw with the sort of Yanmega and Mew EX version of Dialga last format. And then the other cards that we were playing with this combination of Arceus and Dialga were the Shaman cards. We had the Flagrant Flower Garden Shaman card, I think from Spacetime Smackdown, and then we had the new one, the Colorless Shaman that was from Triumphant Light, which gave basic Pokemon free retreat. Another good card, but I think what people are kind of settling in right now, at least for now, is that Mew EX is still pretty valuable. I think with the heavy water seeing play, the water deck seeing play in the format, I think Mew EX is still a pretty good card in general, just across the board as a secondary attacking option. And then this Shaman here seems to be a little bit better than maybe the other Shaman. Just that additional healing factor probably comes in clutch in a variety of different scenarios. So this first place deck was playing Mew EX, which again, I did kind of assume it would be good. It sort of panned out to be, I guess, in the #1 placing deck this week. But again, we'll have to see. I think as time goes on, as the meta shifts, it'll really change what other kind of support cards we want to throw into this archetype. We do see 2 copies of Leaf, so this was sort of the other way that you would play the deck, right? If you weren't playing the Sky Support Shaman, I think is the ability on the colorless one that gives your basic Pokemon 1 less retreat cost, then you're gonna have to play Leaf because Dialga and Arceus both have a retreat cost of 2, which means that they're gonna get stuck in the active spot, and that's not necessarily super great because we would sometimes rather retreat out of our Dialga early on turn 2 or turn 3 to go into Arceus EX to take that KO with Ultimate Force, or if we're leading off with Arceus, we would like to retreat into Dialga so that we could start getting those metallic turbos off. So it does make sense if we're not playing Sky Support Shaman, we should be playing 2 Leafs. We're not playing too many other supporter cards in the deck. I mean, I guess we are. We're playing 2 Research, 2 Giovanni, and 1 Cyrus. This is another card that I did assume would be really valuable in Arceus decks was Giovanni. I think it just helps with the math. 130 is a little bit of an awkward number, especially since Arceus itself has 140 HP, and so do a lot of different Pokemon in the format. So I think that Giovanni is certainly a really good a strong contender for one of the more important cards to be playing in this particular archetype. There's still a lot of Giant Cape going around, but I still think that Giovanni is a really good inclusion. 1 Cyrus, a lot of people I think were playing 1 Sabrina, 1 Cyrus, but I think 1 Cyrus is probably enough for this deck. I don't think that Arceus decks really matter. They don't care that much, I should say, about gusting. It's really about, you know, just getting into Arceus and start hitting for 130 turn after turn. Not much your opponent can really do, and 1 Cyrus in the late game should be enough of a win condition to just sort of take that last KO. So I like 1 Cyrus in the deck. Not too much room in here. I think 2 Potions is also really important. I think it goes really well with this Shaman. It's a lot of healing with the Giant Cape. Can keep Dialga alive for a bit longer than you might expect, especially for going first, and we're basically a turn behind, and we're not able to Metallic Turbo until turn 3. Those Potions and Giant Capes and the Shamans, excuse me, could be a really big difference. So I like that a lot. 2 Rocky Helmet, 1 Giant Cape. I really like this deck list. I think as far as Arceus and Dialga goes, this is about as correct as I could possibly, I think, assume this deck could be built, at least right now. So I really do like this particular list. So shout out to the #1 player here, 13, 1, and 2, a very good record. Let's quickly take a look at the #2 deck list, and we see that it is very, very similar. We're playing 1 less Giovanni. We're playing 2 Giant Capes and no Rocky Helmets, but we are playing 1 copy of Mars. Mars is interesting as well. I think people are kind of sleeping on Mars. I think it's actually a bit better, especially in, you know, I mean, this deck lost in the finals, but in the mirror match where your opponent's playing 1 copy of Cyrus, and oftentimes that Cyrus is the win condition to win games, it can be really, really good to use Mars to potentially, you know, get that Cyrus out of our opponent's hand and make them just go, you know, maybe -1 or maybe -2 and card advantage in their hand, and then therefore buy yourself basically an extra turn to where your opponent doesn't have Cyrus, that, you know, he can kind of win the game. So I think that Mars is actually really good as sort of a counter Cyrus strategy. A deck like this is playing 1 Sabrina, 1 Cyrus, 1 Mars, 1 Giovanni, so playing a bit 1 of everything. I don't hate it. It's a little bit, of course, less consistent. I do think Giovanni's really good. No Rocky Helmet is also kind of interesting as well. Rocky Helmet is just still a really good card. 20 damage is very significant, especially in a format that's heavily dominated by Dialga doing, multiple Metallic Turbo attacks early on. That's a lot of chip damage that Rocky Helmet can provide. I actually do like Rocky Helmet in the format, but it's tough. There's only so many deck slots, and realistically, you know, we're playing 2 Potions and 2 Shaman and Giant Cape anyway. So in the mirror match, I'm not sure exactly how useful it is. I'm sure there's some scenarios where Rocky Helmet does win you games, but overall, I like the Mars inclusion in here. I think that both of these are very similar. 2 copies of Leaf, you know, we still have the Giovanni, we have the Mew, we have the Shaman. Very, very similar deck lists, just changed a little bit. I think it gives proper contrast on like what we can change, I think, realistically when we're building these lists. And yes, it did, this version of the deck did lose in finals, but I think those are both really, really strong deck lists. And then quickly, I want to take a look at the #3 spot, which is again, yeah, actually the exact same. This is the exact same list as the #2 placing deck. So very interesting as well. I think people are kind of settling in on what they believe is the best way to play Arceus and Dialga. I like Flagrant Flower Garden Shaman. I actually think it really does matter. You know, 170 HP on Dialga with Giant Cape, you know, with the potions, with the 10 HP healing every turn with Shaman, it really can be enough, honestly, to live that extra turn, which can be a pretty big difference, actually, especially in a format where, again, you know, a lot of decks are just kind of hitting you for 130, right? A lot of decks are playing Arceus, so to stay above that 130 HP threshold is really important, especially since most of these decks are doing a little bit of chip damage early in the game, specifically Dialga decks, right? So it's nice to be able to use Potion and Shaman to heal that 30 damage every turn, keep your Pokemon above that 130 threshold, and that can be really the difference of you living a KO from an Arceus in the late game or not. So I really do like that combo, and I think that we've somewhat at least figured out, at least it seems right now, what the best way to play Arceus and Dialga, or build these Arceus and Dialga decks are, which is pretty interesting. And this is going to be the Rampardos deck that won, or didn't win, but what placement was this? Let me go back. Third place. So this is the Rampardos and Lucario deck that got third place in the tournament. The highest representation of fighting in the tournament. Again, this is the archetype that won last week as sort of that surprise counter meta pick to Arceus and Dialga. Again, I think things more balanced out this week in terms of, you know, the variance of different decks that interacted in Top Cut. So this deck could have easily won this week. It just didn't end up doing so, but I do think that this is still one of the top contenders of this particular format. And as we see, just a 2-2 Cranidos Rampardos line, 2-2 Riolu Lucario line, and we're playing one Sudowoodo and one Marshadow. So I think this deck has some problems. Again, the fossils don't count as basic Pokemon when they're in your deck, so we're forced to either start with Riolu, Sudowoodo, or Marshadow. All of those Pokemon have a retreat cost of 1, and they have low energy attack costs, so realistically, they should all be pretty flexible in the early game. We can start off with Sudowoodo. So I think Sudowoodo was really, really good. When boosted by Lucario, we're doing upwards of 70 to, 90 damage for 1 energy on a basic, which is really, really strong. 80 HP as well. We're living 3 hits from a Metallic Turbo Dialga, which is really strong. We're able to get some early damage off. And then just start sweeping with Rampardos, which can 1-hit KO Arceus when hitting for weakness. Really, really strong archetype here. It's very much a perfect counter to Arceus decks. Lucario can basically buff Sudowoodo and Marshadow and Rampardos really effectively. I think it's really, really good. I think that there's a lot of different reasons why this deck is good, but I think Sudowoodo is a little bit better than anything else we had that would fit that slot previously. I think Hitmonlee is still good. In fact, you know, I don't know. We'll have to see. There's not as much like Charizard or Gyarados running around in the format. So there, I don't know. Less Hitmonlee means that there's more room for decks like that to do well. In fact, I kind of would assume that Gyarados would be pretty good in this format, but I don't know exactly how many people are playing Gyarados. We'll have to check. But we see 1 copy of Mars as well. 2 Research, 1 Sabrina, 1 Cyrus. We don't have room for any tool cards or much item cards or supporter cards in here because we're running so many Pokemon. I think that's really the only downside to this deck. However, Pokemon Communications is going to help us find the Pokemon that we need. Just a lot of evolution Pokemon in this deck can make it flow a little bit awkwardly, but realistically, if we're drawing Pokemon, it's better than drawing not Pokemon. So a deck like this flows a bit better than you might think as well. Of course, you know, we have to draw into our Skull Fossils early on or else this deck is just not really functionable in the late game. That's really the only downside, but sometimes that doesn't happen, sometimes it does. Overall, this deck is perfect counter to Arceus and Dialga, while being a somewhat strong deck against most other particular decks in the format. Rampardos is just really, really strong. 150 HP, 130 when boosted by Fighting Coach. It's just enough to take KOs on almost everything in the format, and I think that's a very significant card. Honestly, probably the best fighting type Pokemon in the game right now, which is pretty funny considering how we have a lot of fighting EX Pokemon. None of them are just as substantial, or I guess as they don't provide as much value from an attacking perspective as Rampardos does. And things like Aerodactyl, rather. Aerodactyl's ability is good, but in the format right now, there's not a lot of Pokemon evolving in the active spot. So for that reason, I think it makes sense that Aerodactyl's maybe not as good. It also has less HP, which is pretty funny. So yeah, I think there's just limited options. I think Gallade is still pretty good. I think we did see a Gallade place fairly high, but I think as far as Lucario and Rampardos decks go, we kind of understand, you know, what those decks are going to be built like. There was a Gallade here at 19th place, which again was very similar. No Marshadow in this deck, which I think is very interesting. Just 2 Sudowoodo, 1 Hitmonlee, and then the Gallade line. Leaving some room here to play some maybe extra trainer cards. 1 Cyrus, 1 Sabrina, 2 X-Speed, 1 Pokemon Communications, 2 Rocky Helmet. So interesting for sure. I think Marshadow is good. Like theoretically, Hitmonlee Marshadow should in itself be a decent counter to Arceus, but then you still have to get over the Dialga wall because it can just keep attaching to itself and then start hitting for 100 damage. Gallade can kind of fix that, you know, can kind of deal with that Dialga if it does end up attaching to itself. So Gallade is a pretty strong option against a Dialga that would be attacking, whereas the Rampardos decks maybe can't necessarily handle a Dialga with Giant Cape. So that's interesting to note as well. I think that as far as Gallade goes, maybe you don't need Mars Shadow, if I'm being honest with you. Maybe just gonna have to, just kind of significantly boosting, I guess, the lead-off Pokemon, or boosting, I guess, the chances of us leading off with one of these early game Pokemon that we would prefer to lead off with, like Sudowoodo and Hitmonlee. So I do actually like this particular build of Gallade as well. Overall, I just don't think Gallade is as good as Rampardos, which is why it's seeing less play, but overall less success as well. If we go to 5th place, we actually did see an Articuno 18 trainer deck, and I'm not super surprised by this. These 18 trainer water decks are pretty good. I think a lot of people have, I guess, just gone under the assumption that Palkia as an 18 trainer deck is a bit better than Articuno, just because it has more damaging potential. We would rather at least have the opportunity to 1-hit KO Pokemon than to more consistently 2-hit KO Pokemon. I think that explosivity of Palkia is just a bit better in a lot of scenarios, especially when you're going up against decks that are leading off with either Arceus or Dialga. Sometimes, you can get that 150 attack off with Palkia on your first or second turn, and that just kind of wins you the game. Whereas Articuno, yes, technically you can get your Blizzard off, but with Potions, with Shaman, with Giant Cape, we're not even 2-hit KOing Dialga in a lot of scenarios. So I think that Palkia is a bit stronger in that respect. The bench damage as well is pretty significant. So I don't know. I think that they're both really, really good. We'll have to take a look at the win rates. But again, with Irida, with Misty's, I actually really like Celestic Town Elder in this deck too. That's pretty funny. Once our first Articuno goes down, we can just put a second one on the bench. I guess that has some niche scenarios. I think maybe putting a Mars in here instead of Celestic Town Elder might be better, but I don't know. This is really interesting. We'll have to check out whether or not this is like the better way to go here. But technically speaking, like, you have 140 HP, so like if we put a full HP Articuno on our bench and we retreat into it, that would force our opponent to necessarily have Cyrus as an out, right? Or else, they have to attack us an extra turn and we're technically living. So I think that's kind of interesting as well. Definitely an interesting play. But yeah, 18 Trainer Articuno, these water decks are just so good. It's a little bit unfortunate that they're best played as 18 Trainer decks, which is kind of funny. Here's the Palkia version, which was effectively placed the same as the Articuno deck in the that we just look at in terms of the standings here. It's basically the exact same deck. No Celestic Town Elder, so I think one thing's different here, maybe an extra Sabrina, I forget. But yeah, it's just it's just an interesting world out here for the water decks. I think Irida is just such a strong card. It's a very questionable decision why they gave us Irida in Pokemon Pocket, especially when they already saw how strong Erika's was in the previous formats with Executor, and how strong the water archetype is and how much support it's gotten over the last few expansions. For us to also have a very, very good healing card, a card that's arguably better than Erika's for the water archetype, is just crazy. I'm actually just very surprised that we got this card, but yes, it does make these water decks that much better. Palkia has a lot of HP with Giant Cape, that's 170. We can attack early damage with Slash for 30 damage. We can heal up. We can Misty's to pop off. We can do Giovanni to do that extra chip damage. We can heal up with Potions. It's just a very, very good deck. And I just really love the water archetype. It's kind of interesting to play it because it does still seem very high rolly, but I mean, no matter how you slice it, they're just really good. They get a lot of good cards and they just do their thing. So this is the other Palkia deck that's kind of taking over, which is really interesting. So this goes back to that Oceanic Gift, initial way that we were playing Palkia, right? Which was with, Vaporeon and Palkia and Manaphy to kind of pull a bunch of energies with Manaphy and then, move those energies with Vaporeon to attack a little bit more consistently with Dimensional Storm in the late game. But this is different. So we're not playing Vaporeon, and when you do play Vaporeon, it takes up a lot of spaces in your deck. So instead of playing the whole Vaporeon package, we're just actually playing Origin Form Palkia, which gives us kind of a secondary, better target for that second energy of Oceanic Gift. So we can't move those extra energies to a single Palkia, but what we can do is that utilizing Oceanic Gift along with Misty's and our manual attachments for the rest of the game, it should allow us to spread those energies, but still pile up energies pretty effectively on two pretty significantly powerful attacking Pokemon. What's really interesting with this Origin Form Palkia, and I'll pull this up so people can see it a bit better. It's a basic Pokemon, 120 HP. This came out in Triumphant Light, I believe, or maybe it came out in Space Time Smackdown. I don't really remember, but it's got 120 HP, which is a lot for a basic Pokemon, and it just has the Zone Smash attack. You flip a coin, if heads, it does 60 more damage. So for 3 water energies, we could do 60, but we have a 50% chance to do 120, and that is actually quite a bit of damage for 3 energies on a basic Pokemon, especially a single prize Pokemon. It's very inconsistent, of course, it's a 50-50 chance, but you gotta look at this one way, whereas on average, this attack is doing, 90 damage, on average, right? So 60 plus 120 is 180, divided by 2 is 90. So technically speaking, we're doing on average 90 damage for 3 energies, which isn't that bad. But again, 120 isn't enough to one-hit KO Pokemon, so that number doesn't necessarily matter. It just comes down to the fact that sometimes we have an extra attacking option that we can attack for only 3 energies that can possibly hit that 120 number. And if you look at this, this is how I kind of look at this. And if we go back, let's go back to the deck list. The way that I look at this particular archetype and this build of Palkia, and why I think a lot of people are playing this, and why it seems a little bit better, or why I think it is maybe a little bit better than what I had initially assumed it might be, is because of like the different attack value like vectors almost. Like if you look at it in like segments of attack damage. So Palkia EX can do 30 damage, or it can do 150. And if Origin Form Palkia can do 60 damage or 120. So if you look at all of the different scenarios of damage output that we have between 2 of these attacking Pokemon, we have 30 damage, 60 damage, 120, and 150. So that just basically gives us more options to fulfill certain attack costs for technically less energies. Whereas like with Slash, yes, it's not a lot of energy, not a lot of damage, but we only need 1 energy to do it. Or we can do 150, but we have to discard those energies and we need 4 energy to do that. So it does seem like the middle ground for Palkia EX is almost non-existent, where it's like we're doing a little bit of damage or we're doing a lot. Whereas Origin Form Palkia, it's kind of in the middle. So it kind of fixes some of that math to help us maybe have an additional option to attack with. Whereas Palkia EX, we're either doing 30 or we're either doing 150 or we're just doing 30, where a lot of times we would like to do in the middle of that. So I think that's what Origin Form Palkia does to us. There's actually a lot of scenarios where like maybe we're just slashing for a couple turns and then our opponent just has like 60 HP left. So why not just go ahead and use Origin Form Palkia and then Zone Smash instead of popping off with Dimensional Storm and discarding those energies? We could save it to 1-hit KO and bring something up later in the game. So I do like it. I think technically speaking, the ability to attack for a lot of different attack values is technically makes the deck more consistent in its approach, although of course Zone Smash is in itself a very inconsistent attack, but it is a water type Pokemon. You can attach Giant Cape to it. This thing goes to 140 HP, which is above the Arceus damage threshold. Keep that in mind. We can also heal it up with Iridas. And like I said, a couple Oceanic Gifts in the early game, a couple Misties, both of these Pokemon are ready to attack. It's really significant. The other thing that we can do is we can go into Manaphy, then go into Origin Form Palkia, and even if both of those Pokemon get KO'd, then we can then also go into, at the end of the game, go into Palkia EX. So if we play our cards right, we can force our opponent to KO 3 Pokemon, whereas technically speaking, if we were playing Manaphy and then only Palkia, if our opponent KOs the Manaphy, then they only have to KO 1 Palkia. Does that make sense? So like the way that the prize cards work, or I guess the point system work in Pokemon Pocket, since you only have to take three prizes to win, playing Manaphy with just Palkia wouldn't be that good, because if Manaphy goes down, then we only have 1 Pokemon left and our opponent wins the game. Whereas if we're playing Origin Form Palkia, our opponent can KO Manaphy, and then they also have to KO Origin Form Palkia, which has a lot of HP, and then after that, then they also have to KO Palkia EX. So that's pretty significant. That in its own right, I think, is enough reason to play Origin Form Palkia. I think it's a really interesting interaction, if I'm being 100% honest with you. But yeah, anyway, so those were sort of the top decks that won. If we go down, there was a Gyarados deck here I forget what place this was. But yeah, so this is interesting. We're not playing Greninja. I don't know if Greninja is necessarily really relevant right now. I think that the extra damage with Rough Skin, Druddigon, or Kangaskhan fixes sort of that chip damage. Gyarados has a lot of HP. This is what I was saying. I think that Gyarados is actually a little bit better in this format without as much Hitmonlee seeing play, so I think that's really interesting. So shout out to this Gyarados player. I think Gyarados is actually pretty good. In that 32nd place, we have a Dark-type Arceus deck. I think this is sort of the best way to play Dark-type decks right now. Magnezone definitely falling out of favor. I think that 110 damage that Magnezone does just isn't enough, personally, at least in this current format. There was a Darkrai Magnezone deck here at 37th place. And one here at 44th place. But yeah, other than that, and then if we go down here, so there's really no grass decks. And what I'm going to do now is we're going to skip over, because I do quickly want to talk about the Spragels and Hooglandia tournament. What I want to do is look at the metagame tab real quick. So if we go here and we go to playing to win, this was the distribution of decks that made it into top cut, which I believe was top 64, right? I could be wrong about that. Let me go to the details here so we can kind of get that figured out. Yeah, top 64, right? I believe. Yeah, I think this was a top 64 cut. So if we go to metagame and then we go to playing to win, this was the distribution of all of the decks that made it into top cut. So again, 26 Arceus and Dialga, that's 40% of top cut, pretty significant portion. And then we had 15 Rampardos and Lucario, a very significant portion. But again, all of these water type archetypes are broken out into a bunch of different categories. So there was 4 Palkia EX, 4 Articuno EX, 3 Origin Form Palkias, and then if we go down, was there... Okay, and then 2 Gyarados. So, okay. So, yeah, technically speaking, what is this? So that's 8 plus 3, so 11. So technically less water decks made it into top cut than Rampardos and Lucario, but definitely the number 3 most significant archetype, I would say for sure. 3 Gallade decks, I believe, made it in. There was actually Lucario and Sudowoodo that made it in. A couple of Darkrai Magnezones made it in as well, and a couple Gyaradoses, and then 1 Exeggutor. So this is really what the format's looking like, kind of shaping up to look like right now, which is a little bit more top heavy than I honestly initially assumed that this format would be. I thought that there would be initially more counterplay to Dialga and Arceus available to us. Now, I'm not saying that people aren't counterplaying, and I just don't think there's a lot of really good options to counter Dialga and Arceus, and I think that Rampardos and Lucario is really the only significant option to that. And then as far as other decks that are contenders on the outside of those 2 decks, it really is just the water decks, and particularly Palkia and Articuno, which is interesting. But let's go ahead and let's take a look at the combined metagame here. And as we see, a very significant portion of the tournament, 23, almost 24%, playing Dialga and Arceus. So not surprising here, again, if we look, about a 51% win rate. So pretty standard, pretty average to what it has been. I think actually in the first week, this was up around 55%. So it's gone down a little bit more of an equilibrium in terms of the win rates here. Kind of what we would expect, both Dialga and Rampardos falling closer to 50%, which I do think is probably correct. What is surprising to me is that Articuno here, this is a smaller sample size at 4% of the meta share at 48%, so not a great outing this week for Articuno, but if we look at Palkia, 56%. So yes, Palkia EX is still remaining the #1 most successful deck from a win rate perspective of this format, but not nearly the #1 most played deck. I do think that the water type archetypes are split. That's why we see here like 52 Articuno, 44 Palkia, and 43 Palkia Origin Form. If you combine these up, that equals it to be actually more than Rampardos and Lucario. So realistically, these water decks are making up about, the second most played archetype, about 13-14% of the meta share. So I think that kind of makes sense. I think that water is technically better than Rampardos right now, but the way that Limitless categorizes them, it separates them into different archetypes on the list here, which is why they're not like anywhere close from a meta share perspective to Rampardos and Lucario. But the win rate here for Palkia is tremendously high. Even just 18 trainer Palkia was higher than Origin Form Palkia, which is interesting because a lot of people chose to play Palkia Origin Form. I'm not sure. I'll have to playtest this and to see really whether or not Palkia Origin Form is better than just 18 trainer Palkia. The win rate says otherwise, but the sample sizes here aren't anything super massive. This is only like a 16 or 18 game difference, 18 win difference from like the sample size perspective. So, I mean, that could change for sure. And I guess we'll take a look at the Spragels Hooglandia tournament as well. But if we go down here, like the grass decks have really fallen off. And this is something I'm pretty guilty of. I thought that the format would, I guess, change. Like I thought that the metagame would change as time went on to favor some of these grass decks a little bit more so, but it really turned out not to be the case. I thought that the grass decks would be the stronger counters to Rampardos and Lucario, but they really did not turn out to be the case. And I think that this tempo-based format right now, with a lot of these high HP Pokemon also dealing pretty decent damage like Arceus and Palkia, they just actually have good matchups against the grass type cards and the grass type archetypes, which makes them just not, that makes the grass decks not very well positioned in the metagame as we see here. A smaller sample size for sure, but only a 40% win rate for Leafeon. And if we go down to Exeggutor, only a 44% win rate. And again, only 21 people playing Exeggutor and Celebi. So really the #1 grass deck is actually Arceus and Cardivine, which is really just an Arceus deck with like that aggro grass Cardivine card, which had a 51.5% win rate. So yeah, I think that grass is really on the out right now for a variety of reasons. I think that the water decks basically have kind of taken that spot. They have the healing factor and sort of the sustain factor that the grass decks had before. They're a little bit less aggressive, but they're a lot better from a tempo perspective in the mid to late game and their damage output, which kind of makes them a little bit better in this format where Arceus is really the defining factor, I think, for this current metagame. And until we get new cards or more cards released to Pokemon Pocket, we really have limited options for cards that can contend against Arceus. I think it's so funny if we go back and we talk about how a lot of people were, I guess, assuming that Arceus wasn't even a real card or that it wasn't going to be that strong. When I saw Arceus, I was like, this card is better than like every other EX card, and it's a colorless Pokemon, which means like, why would anyone play something other than Arceus? Which is kind of what we're seeing right now. You're either playing Arceus or you're playing Palkia, and if you are playing Arceus, you should probably play Dialga. And that's the format. Charizard here, 40% win rate, which is tough here. Again, I think that Charizard just also kind of struggles realistically. It just isn't fast enough, and Dialga with Arceus combines for enough damage to KO Charizard and Moltres, so it just isn't in a great spot. Again, some of these aggro decks really haven't seen that much success either, which is kind of terrifying. You would hope that we would have both some more mid-range and aggro archetypes seeing success, but that's just really not what the format has kind of panned out to look like. I think that these tempo decks are just massively overtuned, and something like Dialga and Arceus has so much HP and is still doing a consistent amount of damage from a pretty early position in the game. There's just not a lot of things that can really compete with it. The only thing that can compete is something like Rampardos, and that's mainly because it's hitting for weakness, which I think is just really tough. So I think there's definitely an imbalance in the format right now. I'm not saying it's super disappointing, but I think if you really want to be competitive right now, you kind of are just playing Arceus, or you're playing a counter to Arceus, or you're playing the water decks, and that can be a little bit disappointing to some people. Yes, technically you have the possibility to do well with maybe some Turbo Arceus or some Gyarados decks or things like that, but realistically, you're pretty limited. One thing's interesting here are the 10 people playing Executor and Arceus, but they 55% win rate. Dialga and Mew EX here as well, 53% win rate. Gallade here at 52% win rate. So this is interesting. Arceus and Executor could be a pretty good combination, actually. If you think about the early game aggression that Executor has and the high HP, that could be a really good partner with Arceus. I have to actually look into this particular archetype. Let's take a look here. So none of these players made it too far into the tournament. There was only 10 people playing it. But okay, so we're now playing. Okay, so we're playing the Power Link Carnivine with Executor, which is pretty interesting. Just gives you kind of another front-loaded option in the Arceus deck. And of course, you kind of need more Pokemon to do the full damage with Arceus. So I actually do like this archetype. But at the same time, I'm looking at this particular deck and I'm thinking, is this even better than playing Dialga Arceus? Like, is there a reason why we would play this version and not Dialga and Arceus, right? And that's kind of the downside to playing, or I guess the metagame right now is that, you know, Arceus is really the card that's defining the metagame. So what's the best way to play Arceus? I think it is Dialga, and I think we've known that since the beginning. So it's kind of interesting to see how things have panned out. But anyway, yeah, that's going to be the results from the Ursiiday tournament. So now quickly, I just want to go ahead and quickly take a look at the Spragels tournament, the Hooglandia-Spragels tournament, which had a few less players, but like I said, I think that the metagame is going to look a little bit different. Like I said, we typically cover the Ursiiday tournament, so we do a little bit of meta manipulation here on this channel, but for the most part, things should be somewhat the same, but also different. Let's quickly take a look here. As we see, Palkia and Origin Form Palkia actually did win this tournament. So here was the winning deck list from the Hooglandia-Spragels tournament. Very similar, I think the exact same deck that we saw did fairly well in the Ursiiday tournament. Very interesting for sure. I don't know, like I said, if this is technically better than Palkia and or 18 Trainer Palkia. Depending, we'll have to see if it is better against the top matchups, right, being Arceus and Dialga. So let me quickly take a look at this, actually. We're in the metagame tab. Oh, no, we went back. Okay. How do we go? Oh, over here. Okay. So, okay, interesting. So Palkia won this tournament, but there wasn't much Palkia representation really at all. Other than here at 8th place, and this was actually playing Glaceon, 9-2, 8th place. Glaceon getting its first top 8 appearance of Triumphant Light. Here we go. Okay, and this is interesting here for sure. Actually, no, I actually like this. So we are playing the Vaporeon. Okay, so this makes sense, right? So I think if we're playing Glaceon, we probably just want to also play Vaporeon. Makes sense because we're able to evolve Eevee into it as well, and then we can pair it with the Manaphy Oceanic Gift package with Palkia. So this is interesting. So this is kind of a throwback to just that original build of Palkia with Oceanic Gift, Manaphy, Vaporeon. But now we're able to just tie in Glaceon as, I guess, a secondary option. I don't really know the upside to playing Glaceon instead of not playing Glaceon, because technically, like, yes, it does fit into the deck because it does evolve from Eevee as well. It is a water-type Pokemon, but there's really no advantage to using Glaceon above, like, playing Palkia, or even just the Origin Form Palkia, which is pretty interesting. Like 90 damage for 3 energies is not good. Especially on a Stage 1 Pokemon with 140 HP. You would honestly maybe just rather play Starmie, which can attack for 2 energies. We do have the Snowy Terrain, I guess, here, which can be pretty effective, but I don't know if that extra chip damage really matters in the long run. Very interesting, a very interesting deck list here. I wonder if this deck kind of just got carried by the Palkia aspect of it, but interesting nonetheless to see Glaceon placing 8th here in this this tournament, and we did have a Palkia and Articuno combo deck make it here. This is going to be a 17 trainer deck, which is pretty interesting. Look at that. We've seen 18 trainer. We've seen 16 trainer. Why not 17 trainer, right? Why not? We're getting crazy over here. But yeah, no, pretty funny. Pretty funny. Not Not gonna lie. Let's see. So we have Gallade here. I think this is just a normal Gallade deck. Yeah, this time we are playing no Pseudo-Widow, but we're playing Hitmonlee, Hitmonchan, Marshadow. Okay. Still very similar stuff here. We did see, okay, so some more interesting decks did make it a little bit farther up in this tournament. I think that makes sense for the most part. I'm not going to say that the Ursiiday tournament was more competitive, but I think for the most part, most of the players of that tournament are people that play in the other Ursiiday tournaments, which means that they're probably a little bit more attuned to sort of what the Ursiiday's metagame looks like. Maybe that's, I don't know, is that safe to say? Who knows? Let's see. So there was actually a Darkrai Weavile deck that got 20th place, which is pretty interesting. I actually don't mind this deck at all. I just don't think that it hits enough. It's tough to me because I guess with Rocky Helmet, with Scratching Nails and the Dawn combo, like technically we can do enough to take some KOs early on, but I don't know if we're doing enough damage as consistently as, some of the other top decks in the format, which kind of makes this deck feel a little bit underwhelming when compared to some of the other top decks in the format. But it did place pretty well here, so shout out to Weavile. And then here we actually have an Infernape deck with Heatran, and this is actually the small Arceus, which is really interesting. So this is kind of cool. Again, I think that Infernape is pretty good in the format as well. I don't think that people are going to choose to play Infernape and Heatran and Arceus. Like, this was an archetype we saw a little bit early on in the format, but I think a lot of people have moved off of it in favor of a lot of those other decks that we're seeing at the top of the format. But realistically, Infernape isn't actually that, terribly positioned in the metagame right now. I just don't think that it's, something that I would choose to play maybe as much. Let's quickly take a look at the metagame tab here, and let's see if there's any massive difference in the win rates here. Yeah, okay, so a very big difference, actually. So, Dialga and Arceus, very similar meta share here at 23%, 53.5 win percentage, so a bit higher, I would say. That makes sense, but I think because less people were playing Lucario and Rampardos in this tournament, although that still had a good win rate at 54%. What's really interesting here, which was a very stark difference, was the difference in win rates actually between Palkia EX Origin Form and just the 18 trainer Palkia. Now, this is a very small sample size, realistically, but yeah, 54% win rate for Palkia EX Origin Form and only a 46% win rate for non-Origin Form Palkia, which is a very, very big difference. This is the lowest win rate I've seen so far of this format for Palkia EX, and I'm not exactly sure why that's the case. Very interesting for sure. Everything else here is pretty standard. Like, it all kind of fit what the Ursiiday's tournament data was, but I mean, this is a smaller sample size, so I guess it is kind of tough to say. Let's quickly take a look at the matchups for Palkia here for this tournament, because I'm kind of curious why it struggled so much. I guess the small sample size, it just got rolled by Dialga and Arceus here at 25%. I guess that's probably a significant reason, because it did do well against most other things in the format, which is just interesting for sure. So I think the small sample size really just kind of led to this deck, the data here being a little bit different. I guess that kind of makes sense overall. But yeah, the standings here are pretty interesting. Palkia did end up winning this particular tournament. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw Palkia win a little bit more in the coming weeks for the Ursiiday's tournament. So I think the Spragels tournaments aren't weekly, whereas the Ursiiday tournaments are. We can probably expect to see the Spragels and the Spragels and Hooglandia tournament probably monthly, I would assume. We'll have to see. Maybe they'll end up doing them weekly, which could be really, really cool. I want to cover them both this week because they both had a lot of players. They both were about 1,000 players, so I thought they were definitely worth mentioning. And it would be interesting, like I said, to kind of look at the contrast between the two. But the results were all definitely very similar. Palkia winning the Spragels tournament, Dialga and Arceus winning the Ursiiday's tournament. All things we would expect, and then, Rampardos and Lucario kind of being right below there here at second place and then third place of the Ursiiday's tournament. So, yeah, I think that's kind of where we're at for the metagame here. I don't know what I necessarily expected. This isn't like the biggest surprise to me, but it is somewhat of a surprise to see how things have panned out over this first week. Yes, I know that it's Tuesday today. Normally we do the meta report on Monday, but I apologize. So hopefully you guys can forgive me for that. But tomorrow we still will be doing our updated meta tier list, which should have been coming out today, but it'll be coming out tomorrow. And it's actually, I think, going to be a lot different than the initial tier list was last week. So I'm actually really excited to dive into that and see what kind of, ends up being different from last week. It'll be really, really interesting to tell. But anyway, guys, I think we're going to do is we're going to wrap up the video there. Like I said, I apologize for the few days where I was unable to make videos. I just was sick, really, really sick for a few days, and I was unable to, upload any content, and I do apologize about that, but we're getting back on the train here, getting back on the horse, making a lot of videos, and it's I'm just excited. I'm excited to be back. So I appreciate all the support that you guys have given me, and hopefully you guys stuck around and you're still here when I come back. But either way, guys, yeah, I'm gonna get out of here. Peace out. Have a good one. Comment below, by the way. You know, what do you think about the format right now and how things are kind of changing up? Is this kind of what you would expect? What your opinions are? What decks do you think that maybe aren't seeing enough play or aren't seeing enough success? Could see a lot of success. I would love to hear your guys' opinions down in the comment section below. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe. Stay tuned for more videos that are going to be coming out in the next coming days. And yeah, peace out. Have a good one.